This is a short introduction to variables in PHP. Now, a variable in programming is something which, as the name implies, its value can vary as a variable value. So it's helpful to think of a variable as like a container. So think of a variable as being like a bucket. So a variable is like a bucket. We can carry something around in that bucket, and the value of that variable is what's in the bucket. So suppose we have a bucket of fish, or we have a fish. Let's just say we have one fish in a bucket. So to put that fish in the bucket, we say we have our bucket variable, and we assign the value of fish to bucket. Or we can say fish is assigned to bucket, or bucket is set to fish. But what we definitely don't say is bucket equals fish. That's a big faux pas, because equals means something else in programming. So this is the assignment operator. So we just need to get used to, when we're using variables in PHP or any language, we need to get used to saying assigned is assigned the value of. So bucket is assigned the value of fish. Or if we want to read from right to left, fish is assigned to bucket. So that's what our variable does. Then let's just output the variable. So once we have a bucket, we can do things with it. We can carry it around, and we don't need to worry what's in our bucket. And if we want to check, we can just have a look in there. So to have a look in our bucket, we use this echo function, and that just outputs the argument that we pass. In this case, we're passing bucket. Let's just have a quick look. So we see here fish has been output, and we're just to recap, we're using the Skite editor here, and we have Skite configured so that it is this is the path to the PHP processor on my machine, and this is the file that it's executing. You can see it here, and normally this will be output to a web page on the local host my machine, and I'd navigate to localhost slash variables clip PHP if it was in the root, and so on. But this is when we use Skite here, we can go into options, we can go into view, output if we have it correctly configured, and options, vertical horizontal split I have here. So that's where that is, and this bit here in blue is a little bit about the setup of where the PHP processor is, a flag, and the file that it's executing here, and this line here is the actual output, this bit here, and then this last bit is just some information about whether it was successfully executed or not, and in this case exit code 0, so it means it's exited with no error code. The code is 0, so we're fine. So that we can see that a bit later, that will change. So let's just have another look here at our variable. So what we did here was we passed in the name of the variable, and we output the value. We have a value, name, value, and that's the really important bit about to learn about variables. They have a name and a value, and the name doesn't change. So bucket here does not change. We keep our bucket, but we can put various things into it. So say we want to put some water into the bucket instead of the fish. Let's just execute this, and now water is output. So I pressed F5 there to execute this. So we assigned fish, and then we assigned water to the bucket, and water replaced fish. And one thing we could do is we could use this concatenation assignment operator if we want to add water to our bucket instead of replacing it. Let's just see what that does. Let's execute that, and now we have fish water in the bucket because we had fish and we added water. This is the string concatenation assignment operator, which just means we add to the value of the variables. But but the important thing to note here is that this is the name, and this is the value, and the value can change. We can manipulate what's in our bucket, we can have a fish, we can add water, we can do lots of things, and we don't need to remember what we did. We just have a look in the bucket and it tells us what the value was. So that's the basics of variables in programming PHP. Now all of this happens is passed by, if you're used to other programming languages, you'll note that everything here is being passed, or you should note that everything here is being passed by value, not by reference. So we're making a copy of any values and we're passing them in here. So, and there is a way to pass by reference in PHP, but that's we won't go into that here, but the default is always to pass by value. Doesn't make a difference here because we're using literals anyway. If you don't know what that was about, don't worry. So this can vary. This is the variable part of variables, and this doesn't vary, the name. Now the name here, we've called it bucket. We started it here with a $sign. That's what we must do when we name variables in PHP, and this is different to other languages such as Java or C and so on, where you don't need this special character in front of your variable name, and makes PHP a little bit more ugly to look at, a little bit weirder for newcomers to the language. They may find this a bit perturbing. It's in some other languages like Perl as well, but it has some advantages too, which we'll look at in a minute. So that must be your first character in your variable name, and then you can use a letter or an underscore must be the next character, and then for any subsequent characters they can be letters, underscores, or numbers. So basically this one here needs to be a letter or an underscore. So let's say it was a number. Let's see what would happen if we tried to use a number instead of a, let's call it one bucket, and let's see what, already we can see something funny is happening here. So let's just have a quick look. We press F5 and we've got a parse error, syntax error, unexpected, blah 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 blah, on line 3, expecting t variable or $sign, and it's redirected us back here to the line of code in our editor. And you can see actually that Skype was giving us a hint that something was wrong, because this code coloring looks very funny here. So let's just change that back to bucket and run it again, and this time it runs fine. We get execute 0 and fish is output. We'll just go back there and we'll look at the previous example for a minute as well. We see here execute 255, so that's an error. So we're back to execute 0 now. And let's just clear that output screen there. So I just pressed select all and delete. So that's the naming of variables. So they're the variable naming rules. Now there's rules and there's conventions in programming, and both are very, very important. If you don't get your rules right, your program's not going to execute. But if you get your conventions wrong, that can have very serious consequences as well. So not as immediately apparent. So by convention, suppose I want to call this my bucket. This is how I should write it by convention. I use my, and that starts with a lowercase letter, and then the next word just runs into it like this. There's no spaces in variable names, and we use a capital B there for bucket. So this is called camelback notation. So say my fish bucket, let's just call it fish bucket. That's a bad name because we only have fish in there. Let's just change that to mackerel. Now we have my fish bucket, which can hold different types of fish, let's suppose. And because I have these 3 words here that describe my variable, I start the first one with lowercase and the subsequent ones with uppercase. And that's a good example of how you should name your variables in PHP and most modern programming languages nowadays. And there's various conventions for naming variables, but this is by far the most popular one almost across all modern languages now. And it's not a rule, so let's just execute this and see what happens. Press F5 and oops, there's a common mistake now. I didn't update this. I changed my variable name here, but I didn't update it down here, so let's just put it in there and let's just execute that again, and mackerel is output. So it's important to note here that that worked fine. Let's see what happens here if I change this here, and maybe you can just copy that down here then. And you never just, when you're editing, when you're changing a variable or something, you never retype the variable, always copy and paste your variables and your named entities in programming. So now I have my fish bucket here. Let's just execute this again, see if this works, and it does. It works fine, but it's harder to read this. If you notice, if you just try and scan that line, it's much harder to read than this. So it's much better to name it this way, but it doesn't break our program. It's not an error, it's just a convention. And you may think that conventions are not particularly important, and in some cases they're not. So if it's only me writing this program, it's not so important. But as programs scale up and become very complex, conventions almost become as important as rules. It's like if you have a queue and if a queue in a shop, if you have 2 or 3 people, the queue doesn't really matter. But if you have 50 people in a queue, it's only convention. We're only queuing by convention. It's just like bad manners not to queue. But if you have 50 people and they don't queue properly, you're going to have anarchy. You're going to have a real breakdown. So that's a useful analogy to think of why we have conventions in programming and how they can become very crucial as you scale up. You have a lot of people working on a project and so on, or you're trying to understand what other people have written or what you've written yourself in the past. So that's variable naming. You may also see some variables like this in PHP. You may come across a variable like that, and that's an inbuilt PHP variable. You can see Skype has helpfully italicized this for me. It's letting me know that this is a particular PHP word that's already built into the language. So you shouldn't name your variables like this. So it would be a mistake to call this, to create a variable like this, my fish, because PHP thinks, Skype rather, is thinking that I'm talking about a particular inbuilt PHP variable, but I'm not. Oh, my mistake. Skype just italicized all our variables. But nonetheless, you shouldn't name your variables like this, because once you see a variable like this is a convention again. You know that this is an inbuilt PHP variable that's been provided for you by the language. So you have get, post, session. These are all variables we can use in PHP to access special functionality provided to us by the language. So we shouldn't name our variables this way, but we shouldn't be naming them like that anyway. We should be naming them like this.